Welcome to the Leaders and Loggers podcast. On today's podcast, we are celebrating episode number 100 in our first video podcast. We're going to take a look back at the previous 99 episodes, the guests that made them special, and all the lessons we've learned along the way. Celebrate by drinking from America's oldest brewery, a Yuengling Traditional Lager, which is now available in my home state of Texas. My name is Kevin Dawson, and I hope you'll join us for a glass and conversation today. Well, welcome to Leaders and Loggers, and today we are celebrating episode 100. And with that being said, we're also celebrating the launch of our first video podcast, and this is the new Leaders and Loggers podcast studio as we celebrate moving forward a new element to the podcast. If you've been streaming with us for the previous 99 episodes, you've just been able to listen to us. Now you can actually see us, and as you can see, I have a face made for radio. So the audio aspect has been great, but now we are excited to go and move forward with video. And as you can see, we've got this amazing studio behind me with all the different beers that we've had along the way and the beers that we may soon have on the podcast as well. And so I'm really excited for episodes. I mean, 100 episodes is a pretty big deal. Last year, we celebrated episode 50, and we did a big live event with our friends at Tall City Brewery. We had Mayor Patrick Payton, Mayor of Midland, Texas. My friend Matt New, who was on episode 25, performed afterwards, and we had a live audience of 150 join us there at the brewery for a very amazing evening. And it was quite impressive to look back at that point, 50 episodes, thinking that was a big deal, and we were just kind of getting started. Now we're at 100 episodes. And so much has transpired from 50 to 100, and even thinking back from 1 to 100. And it's been phenomenal. I remember launching that very first episode in November of 2019 and thinking, okay, here we go. This is it. And maybe we'll see what transpires. And it took a full 30 days for a whole month just to get to 100 downloads. And now at 100 episodes, just this year alone, we're over 1 million downloads, and it's just phenomenal to see that many downloads, to see that we're in 120 countries, over 30,000 weekly listeners. And thank you so much for being a part of this journey as we've gone one beer at a time, one liter at a time, and have learned so much along the way. But like I said, today is episode 100. And to celebrate episode 100, I went really old school. And by old school, I went with America's oldest brewery, Yuengling, and the Yuengling Lager in particular, to celebrate episode 100. Now, Yuengling has been around for a long time, but in Texas, it's only been available for the last month. And so I'm really excited to have it in Texas today and to be able to share this big moment with such a beloved beer across a good portion of the country. And so cheers to all of you for making episode 100 possible and listening along the way. And there's a reason they've been around so long. It is such a smooth and refreshing malty lager, not heavy, just the right amount of that malt, that almost kind of molasses-like flavor. And so really, really delicious. I am very excited about Yuengling. So is a lot of Texas everywhere. At the launch of this, like Yuengling was just all over the place, promoting that they were coming to Texas. And so they are here. They have several other of their beers available in Texas. And so I'm looking forward to trying those and sharing those with friends along the way. So today's episode is really just me looking back on 99 episodes. I wanted to do something different, and different is video as well, but just to think back, what have we accomplished? What have we learned along the way? And I remember when we published that first episode thinking, here we go. This is, I want to sit down with leaders and I want to talk about leadership issues and organizational cultural issues, because those were important to me and the people that I had been working with along the way. And in doing it so in a way that just felt like two friends sharing beers, sitting at a bar and talking about important things in life and trying to solve big issues in order to inspire the next generation of leaders. And so that's what we set out to do in episode 1. Episode 2, we talked about the new frontier of business ethics, which funny enough, this last 18 months, that topic, I've spoken more at events with that particular topic than anything else. People are trying to figure out, how do we move forward in the age of COVID, the age of new technologies, and how do we lead when what has been the normal ethical standards are changing with the times. And so we talked through and have presented that presentation all across the country these last 18 months, which has been so much fun. Episode 3 was our first guest, and we did it live in Washington, D.C. with my friend Bruce Waller, who has his own podcast now, Life in the Leadership Lane, which just came out with a new book, same title. And I'm really excited to actually read this book. I'm very appreciative of Bruce's friendship. When he launched his podcast, I was his first guest. And so it's been neat. He's celebrating 75 episodes this weekend. So he's getting close to the big 100 episodes. But, we talked about what it looked like to lead and find your lane in his first book, talking about what does it look like to find your lane? How do you lead? And what does that look like as a leader? And we did that in Washington, D.C., which was so much fun. In that experience, as we sat in the hotel bar, sat above everyone else, and you could hear him in the background. It was just such a neat experience. Came back, episode 4, which is a little bit of a recap of all the things that we experienced in Washington, D.C., the leaders that we met, talked about what 21st century leadership looks like, some of the gaps that were involved with it. So it was just such an amazing high of being in D.C. and just being surrounded by national leaders and seeing, history. And we came back, we talked about creating a culture of gratitude, and how gratitude is something that's so important as a leader, that you need to be able to find those little moments of gratitude, because it really can change your attitude for the day. I know that being a leader can carry a lot of heavy stress and a lot of mental anguish. But if you just take a few moments and look for the things that you're grateful for and start with those moments of gratitude and talk about them, you'll see a shift in how you lead that day. And so we talked about, creating a culture of gratitude. And we talked about developing your platform voice. Everybody has a voice. And as a leader, it's good to develop what your voice is, what's your message, how you are going to inspire people. And so we talked about that. And then I talked about my story of waking up from a dream and living out my purpose, and how a lot of us just, we keep dreaming of things to come, and we're so caught up in the dream that we forget to live in the moment and live with intent and purpose for now. And how do we inspire people today? And it was so interesting that particular story as I posted it on LinkedIn, and just kind of being very vulnerable with, here's where I have been and here's where I'm at now, and just some of the things that came out that just a short 6 months later would really come into play. And I think back on that, and as I thought about chasing these dreams, and luckily, I carry this coin, which is this massive coin given to me by Major Scott Petz of the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds when I got to work with them in 2015, and it is one of my most prized possessions, because that was my dream, was to get to fly with the Thunderbirds, and that didn't happen, but to have a chance to work with them, but to move forward beyond there and say, hey, my purpose in living in the now is to develop leaders, teams, and cultures. And I get to do that every single day, and I get to do that every single week on this podcast. And so it's so much fun doing that. And so then next, we talked about developing your leadership pipeline for successful succession. Every organization needs to be thinking, who is going to be the next leader? Who's going to take over, whether it's at the top of the company or who's at the departmental level, like who's the next manager? Because you need to have a good pipeline of good leaders. And if you're not thinking through those things, you're falling behind. And so as leaders, we need to be always on the lookout for, who are we bringing up behind us and preparing to take over when we're not here, or when we're ready to move on, or when someone else is ready to move on. How do we manage that? And we continue that conversation with the next episode, talking about successful succession management, which I had an opportunity to speak on. What does that look like at an event down near Houston the beginning of last year, before we knew anything about COVID and things shutting down. And what does good succession management look like? How do we prepare for the future? And leaders need to be always thinking about the future, but also being present in today, and being able to manage both. And that takes a lot. And so there's a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders who have not thought through, what does succession management look like? Then we talked about, right around Christmas, the gift of servant leadership. Leaders need to approach the mantle of leadership with the attitude of, I'm here to serve those who are under me. It's not the other way around. They're not there to serve you. You're there to serve them. And if you have to have that gift, because it is a gift, not everybody can do this. And this is why organizations that struggle keeping good people keep good people, because the leaders in those organizations really aren't leaders. They're leaders by title, but they don't serve their people. They expect their people to serve them. I need another sip of this Yuengling. So we closed out 2019 and then welcomed 2020. And man, I wish I could turn back the time, turn back the clock and go back in time and say, hey, 2020 is going to be a really crazy year, but it's going to be good at the end. Just be prepared. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster for the first 6 months, because we had no idea what was in store at that point in time. We talked about the very beginning of January of 2020, the 5 disruptive leadership trends that we saw coming that year. And we had no idea that those trends themselves were going to be completely disrupted in just a few short months. And so how do you lead teams in a remote environment, which I did not even talk about at that point in time? I should have. If I could have talked about that then, you could have, taken me out to Vegas. We could have bet on something and probably won, but nobody saw what was coming. Maybe there were those who did, but I sure didn't. And there was a lot of other people who sure didn't. Then we talked about developing a learning mindset, identifying culture misfits. Leaders need to be learners. That's why, books like Bruce's are great resources to learn. I mean, Bruce's book, which is, I love the idea of this book, which is why it kind of inspired this particular podcast. Because in Bruce's book, he takes the lessons of everybody he's interviewed and put it into great thought and great lessons. And so today, as I'm going through these, my previous, I'm remembering these stories and these lessons learned along the way. And as leaders, whether you're reading a book, a magazine, newspaper, online articles, you're listening to podcasts, you're watching documentaries, as long as you're learning, you can be an impactful leader, but you got to share what you learn along the way. And then be able to identify cultural misfits. So every organization has a unique culture, and we try to identify culture as something as simple as, what's just the way that things are done around here? Well, some organizations are very protective of their culture. Others have no idea what their culture is. But as a leader, you have to be able to identify, do the people on your team fit your description of your culture? And if there are people who don't, it could be they're in the wrong area, they're in the wrong role, or maybe they're in the wrong place. And so how do we identify them and help figure out where do we need to move them? Then we had our next guest, my friend Dan Eck, who at the time was the executive director of the Museum of the Southwest. He's now executive director at the Hill Country Conservancy in Austin, Texas. And we talked about what it's like to lead in a nonprofit, where in a nonprofit world, it's very different, because it's seen like you're not going to always compete for talent in a way that a for-profit is. And so how do we as leaders in that world get people to buy into our mission wholeheartedly, that allows them to say, hey, you know what, I can give up a few things that the for-profit world may have available. It doesn't mean that we're just hiring people and paying them nothing. If you want to be a well-driven leader in a nonprofit world, you need to make sure you take care of your people, and that means including paying them around market value, and having those discussions, because a lot of nonprofits think, oh, just because we're a nonprofit, we can get away with paying people less. That's not a good way to manage and take care of people, because you'll lose them. But you lead on a mission, and hopefully you have people on your team who believe and buy into your mission. So we had Dan on, and then we bring about what we talk about, and then we honored Kobe Bryant, because he had passed away that week. And I just had some thoughts on the late and great Kobe Bryant. Growing up as a San Antonio Spurs fan, you can see over there in the corner, I've got, Slam Duncan O's, and those battles between my Spurs and the Lakers in the early 2000s were always entertaining. And while Kobe may have been seen as a villain to some, you cannot ignore the type of mentality he had when he approached the game of basketball. Nobody was going to outwork Kobe, and he was going to give 100% of every night. And then even after basketball, he shifted and became much more human to a lot of people, because he became very involved as a dad. And he was very proud of the fact that he was a dad, and a girl dad at that. And so we talked through those lessons learned, and what the Mamba mentality looked like. And then next week I was live in Chicago, another live event, which was kind of unexpected. I took my equipment with me thinking, okay, I'm going to maybe record a podcast, maybe not. We'll see what happens. Well, it just happened to be that I got snowed in Chicago, but in a very weird way. It snowed here in Texas, so I couldn't come home. It was snowing in Chicago, but I literally got snowed in Texas and couldn't fly home. So I had to spend an extra night in Chicago. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to record a podcast. And I just happened to be right next to the Big Ten headquarters there in Chicago, and across from O'Hare Airport. And so I was like, let's record. I got nothing better to do until my flight leaves the next morning. And what was interesting enough about that week, I met 3 future podcast guests. I had no idea that they were going to come on the show. Now, there was one that I knew, Dave Cooper, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, was a keynote speaker at an event I was at. And then we had this conversation developing your career acceleration formula, and then had and that was led a discussion led by Christine DiDonato and Andy Storch. I had forgot Andy was a part of this, and both Christine and Andy and Dave are all future podcast guests that I had later on, and met them all in this 1 week, learning from them. And so it was just really kind of neat. Then for Valentine's week, we talked about love as a leadership trait. Being empathetic and loving your people is a very important thing about being a leader. If you don't care for your people, you're not going to be an effective leader. Because if you don't care for them, they're going to know it and be like, why should I follow you? What's going to make you inspire me to want to do the things that you're asking of me? And so the greatest thing you can do as a leader in terms of using love is being selfless. And I had this conversation last night with my friend Mandy on Instagram Live, and we talked about what does leadership look like, and I said it's selfless. It means laying down your own wants and your own needs for that of others, and so that's loving as a leader. Then we talked about performance management again, strengths-based engagement, and the culture around that one. And because speaking again at another event near San Antonio, and say, hey, we've got a group of people who want to talk about what does this look like? How do we engage our people? How do we talk about performance management as a leader? And it really boils down to how well and how often are you actually having conversations with your people? And it should be on a one-on-one basis every single week. It doesn't have to be anything big. It can just be a quick check-in, or sometimes it's like, you know what, let me go grab a cup of coffee because we're going to be here for a while, because you may have a lot of needs and I'm going to be attentive to those needs. And so your effectiveness as a leader revolves around how well you have those conversations. And that plays into the whole role of performance management, because if you're doing performance management on an annual basis, that serves no good purpose to leading your team effectively, because they feel like you're only reviewing what happened really in the last 90 days up to that. And if they just had a really crappy 90 days, but their first three quarters of the year were really great, you may forget about that. So it just doesn't do very well. Then the next week we had my freestyle conversation. This was kind of an interesting one. This was literally a therapy session of me venting. I had a former leader of the organization I work for pretty much tell me that I'm not qualified to do the things that I was being asked to do and being invited to speak on, and and said it in front of a big group of people. And that fire and that anger was just kind of burning inside of me. And look at me now. Am I still not qualified? 30,000 people around the world listening to a podcast every week, being able to speak at conferences all over the country, having an opportunity to film a reality television series. And sure, I'm not qualified. And then we talked about Jack Welch, who passed away, and his legacy and what it meant to be an authentic leader. And I talked about this with Mandy the other night. It was just, authenticity or vulnerability as a leader. How can you be relatable? The best leaders are relatable leaders because they allow their emotions, their authentic self to be seen, and that can be scary. And it takes a lot of courage to be okay with that. And as leaders, you just have to be you as best as you can for the sake of your people. Then we talked with my best friend, Natalie Swanner, who had just returned from leading a team of performers overseas for Princess Cruise Lines. And we talked about what's it like to lead when you have so many different unique individuals and you have so little time to do it. And so we had this great conversation about that, and then creativeness and leadership. And so it was just this so much fun. I've known Natalie my entire life, so it really was, and it's this very free flowing, fluid conversation. And Natalie's now back doing that again, now that as the cruise industry and the tourism industry is starting to recover. She's out, on the Princess Majestic out in Alaska at this time, and I'm hoping to go see her on a cruise. That would be nice. I haven't been on a cruise in a long, long time, and I've always made it a point that I will never go on a cruise with my family, but I would go on a cruise with my friends or significant other. But we will see what that looks like. We talked about leading in the midst of adversity, because this was the first time that COVID had shut things down and we didn't know what was going on. And so we were dealing with all this adversity and unknowingness. And so what does it look like to lead in the midst of that? And had we only known then what we know now, what that was going to look like, things probably would have changed very differently. Then we talked about engaging teams in a remote environment, how important it is to have those check-in conversations and be able to create engagement and making people feel connected, even when we're no longer physically around one another. And so we started the conversation. It ended up being a 2-part conversation that we followed up again, leading teams remotely. And that was kind of fun because we had a 2-part beer for that one. We had the Outer Stellar sour ale and the Interstellar sour ale to make that a 2-parter. Then we talked about the importance of developing your leadership network and discovering your strengths. As my friend Bruce always says, is your network is your net worth. And so as leaders, the bigger your network, the greater your influence is going to be. And so, you got to develop a good leadership network. Plus, you never know what will happen when you are leading in that way, when you're growing your network and you're growing these things, because it may be that you meet someone in your network and down the road a new opportunity arises. And so I remember back in February of last year, I had a conversation with a regional president of a bank here in West Texas, just talking about opportunities and collaboration and trying to figure out how do we work together. And we had a great conversation, but there was not really any synergistic opportunity at that point in time. But we said, you know what, let's remain connected. Let's keep engaging. Let's see what happens. And lo and behold, 2 years later, for me, an opportunity arises where I get to partner with that organization. Then we had our 25th episode. My friend Matt New, who is a contestant on The Voice, made it through the initial round and was on John Legend's team, was coached by Usher. And so we talked about, what that experience was like and lessons learned, especially when you're performing at such a high level and you have people like John Legend and Usher, trying to coach you. So how do you learn to be coachable as a leader? Because we always need good coaching. So we talked about that and celebrated with that. And that was actually the first introduction I had to Tall City on the podcast, Tall City Brewing, which, have been a very big supporter of this podcast. And let us host our 50th episode. I now host their Tuesday trivias nights at the brewery, and always have enjoyed working with the guys at Tall City, which is just kind of the importance of the network. And so as I'll talk about that here in just a second. And then we talked about the power of trust as leaders, and what does that look like as a leader? You've got to be willing to give trust first, and making sure your team feels like, oh, you trust me, and then working through those issues in the back end. Then I had my friend Joe Ayler, who is a branding expert, network builder, and a co-owner of Second Story, which is where the shirt Get to Work comes from, one of my favorite shirts to wear. And so, like I was saying, with Tall City and the importance of those networks, and always going to say, hey, support your local breweries wherever you may be. Support your friends and their businesses. So Second Story, Tall City, Hometown Hats, my friends at Hometown Hats with their really cool hats, celebrating different hometowns in Texas and I think New Mexico and Kansas and Oklahoma, and they just keep cranking out new stuff. So special shout out to those guys. We talked about the power of positive psychology. And, you know, we were already starting to kind of feel run down at that point, and just there was a lot that happened, especially that week in particular when I released that episode. So Joe and I released our episode together on May 1st, and lo and behold, I had just partnered with another future podcast guest, Brian and Gabrielle Boucher, and their company Purpose, the Purpose Company, and their program Purpose Mastery. I said, hey, I'm all in. Let's do this. Let's figure out how to make this thing grow and work and leverage my purpose. Going back to that story of waking up from your dream and living out your purpose. Lo and behold, I didn't know at the time that was going to lead to a conversation with them in this really, great program that they've got. 3 days later, May 4th, I'm told, hey, the company I was working for, we're laying you off. With everything going on, we're laying off a whole bunch of people, and unfortunately, you're one of them. So sorry, now what? And in the midst of a pandemic, and thinking what's going to happen next. And I could have taken the approach of falling into a depression and thinking, what do I do? Where do I go? And so I talked to, here's what the power of positive psychology and remaining positive even when it seems like things aren't going the way they are. And I remember that next morning after I woke up, after being told I'd been laid off, and just feeling very pumped to get up and figure out what comes next, because I didn't have anybody telling me you're not qualified anymore, and I could do the things that I wanted. And it was that moment, that week in particular, that really began to be the game-changing week for me, and then for what this podcast has become and all the opportunities that have come beyond that. Then we talked about workplace culture and the team dynamic. And so what does that look like? What does good workplace culture look like? How does a team play into it? And I had been working on creating what the next evolution in the work that I've been doing with organizations, from leadership development, now moving into organizational culture development. And so we talked about, here's what good workplace culture is. Here's what how the team plays in this. And that eventually launched this platform that has been in the works called the Crafting Culture Academy, which will take a 3-pronged approach to first leading as an individual, then leading as a team, and then developing teams of teams to build that culture. So we talked about that. Then the summer of explosion with this podcast. So then I had Brandy Bell, who's the executive producer of Southern Bell & Co., join me at Second Story, where we recorded that episode, and just talking through just being a businesswoman and launching a show and a media network and things along those lines. And just, it was so neat to hear someone else talk through those things. And then the next week, it was a really cool guest. I had Major Justin Hazard Lee, who was a chief of F-35 training systems at the time. He was the host of the Professionals Playbook podcast. I was excited. Obviously, as you're looking like behind me, there's a Top Gun logo up there. Talk about, Thunderbirds. And so talking to a fighter pilot was a pretty big deal for me at that time. And so learned a lot from him. And then the next week, my first really, really big guest, Chris Widener, who was a globally acclaimed keynote speaker and best-selling author, had worked with John Maxwell and Zig Ziglar and Tony Robbins and these titans of leadership. And, had this, and Chris had this massive following of 500,000 people, and just very gracious guest and very great, and I'm still very grateful to Chris, because he then introduced me to, who we'll talk about here in a minute, my most expensive guest, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then I had Alon Hunkins, who was a best-selling author of Cracking the Leadership Code. he was my first international guest. He was in Amsterdam when we recorded. It was 7 p.m. his time. It was noon here. It was kind of crazy to talk to somebody on the other side of the world. And he had just released his book, and it was just so much fun to talk to Alon and learn his thoughts on how do we crack the leadership code. And I remember, as I was reading through his book and just some of the lessons of what it takes was, a lot of things that I knew, but really hadn't put into practice. And so what Alon had done was really taking a lot of things that we know as leaders and put those into very actionable opportunities. And I'm not going to spoil his book. So if you're listening to this and you haven't read it, go check out Cracking the Leadership Code. Alon Hunkins, you get on Amazon. It was, that's where he originally was best-selling author on there. Then we had our first brewery guest, Chris Burns, who was a co-founder and president of Old Ox Brewery up in the Washington, D.C. area. Just neat to learn some lessons from a family-owned business and a growing brewery and how they were able to manage during a pandemic. And so it was just neat to talk to one beer guy to another beer guy and talk leadership along the way. It was phenomenal. And then we had Krishna Mohan, who was the president of Genius Visionary, and talk through his story of being an immigrant, and then the opportunities that being here had afforded him and the lessons along the way, how that affected his real estate business, and then being able to then turn around as a leader, teach others. And so it was just a neat opportunity to talk to him. Then we had Sarah Wolfer, who is the CEO of Girl Boss Sports. So we talked about women in sports and young girls in sports, and how do we inspire women in leaders, women in sports. Sarah was I think she still plays women's professional football as well as soccer. So just a very neat guest opportunity. And then the next episode, my most expensive episode, and I say that because the guest charges $10,000 an hour, and I got him for free. And that was Mark Sanborn, international leadership keynote speaker, New York Times bestselling author. His book, The Fred Factor, was one of the first leadership books I read after graduating high school. And that book has sold over 2 million copies. And it was Chris Widener who said, "Hey, email Mark. Here's his email address. Tell him you had me on your podcast, and just see what he says, because I know he's a craft beer guy and would probably love this opportunity." And so I emailed Mark and said, "Hey, Mark, had Chris on the show. This is what we do when we talk about, and would you be interested in being a guest?" And within an hour, Mark wrote back, "You had me at craft beer. When would you like to do this?" It's just like, whoa, this is really kind of cool to have someone like this. So we have Mark on. I was actually very impressed with Mark's beer selection. I didn't realize how big of a craft beer guy. He has been a craft beer drinker for 30 years. His brother owns a brewery in Pueblo. And so he had a beer stronger than I had. And I thought I was doing pretty well with a double IPA at 10%. He was doing a double IPA at 12%. And so it was just, not to get too far, but it was just, but to get to talk to him, we talked about the Fred Factor, and we talked about some of his other books, and got to talk about his mailman Fred himself. And so that was just, I had Mark on for an hour, my $10,000 episode that cost me nothing. And so I was so grateful for Mark's time, because he was a big guest. And then I had Dave Cooper, and to date, Dave's episode is the most downloaded episode of all my episodes. And it may just be that he's been in some very important things. So Dave is a former Command Master Chief, United States Navy Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6. He served and led the missions in the Bin Laden mission in 2011, and Captain Phillips rescue. So he'd been around some really cool things. And while we didn't really go in depth in telling those stories, because I didn't want to focus just talking about those stories, I wanted to really learn from him what came about. And I still remember the lesson of there's a culture of feedback in the SEALs. That's just there's an expectation that if something's just not right, and you don't feel like, hey, I think there's a better way to do this, then you're expected to speak up and then have a solution. And that's always sat in my mind. And you're hearing my dog Captain making a big mess of something going on. Let me see if well, now back from that wonderful introduction to my dog Captain. And so we were talking about Dave Cooper and just the lessons there. But yeah, that episode has over 60,000 downloads as of today's recording. It's been the most downloaded episode. I think people just like to hear, really great story from someone who's been involved with some very important missions and milestones in U.S. military history in recent time. Then we had Nick Henriksen and Chris Coleman, who were co-founders of a company called Calypso, which they turned around and sold that to a little company known called Carvana, and helped Carvana develop what is now known as Sell to Carvana. So they, and two just young, smart guys who are serial entrepreneurs, and just the lessons that they've learned along the way, talking through what is it like to be an entrepreneur and come up with these ideas and solve things that people haven't thought through. So it was just neat to talk to those guys. They were very knowledgeable, and as an entrepreneur myself, to learn from them, what does that look like. Then episode 40, and Greg Avila, founder and chief content officer of the Untapped app, the world's largest social network for beer drinkers with over 10 million users, joined us for a very fun episode talking about just what is the social aspect around beer, what is it'll look like to develop a tech company like that, and just so many neat things, and just great conversation. Hopefully there's an opportunity to revisit with Greg down the road and see the things that are up, because they've done so much, and we're trying to get more involved with Untapped beyond what we do every week of just posting content on our thoughts on the different beers that we've had. Then the next episode, this was my first episode in person after COVID had begun, and I was in Dallas and got to sit down and have a very good conversation with my friend Tony Bridwell, who was a chief people officer at Ryan, best-selling author. He was a co-host of a podcast called Breakfast with Sis, which I was a guest on. It was my first guest appearance. He's kind of surprised me with it. At the beginning of the year, he's like, "Hey, meet me at Chick-fil-A and they're in Dallas, and come listen to us." His daughter Allie record their podcast, and I show up, and it's like, "Hey, by the way, you're our guest today." I'm like, "What?" So very grateful for that and that friendship that came about. But Tony was a keynote speaker at a conference I was hosting, and I said, "Hey, Tony, I would love for you to come on my podcast and let's talk about your book, Saturday Morning Tea." And that is the longest episode to date at 75 minutes. Because we could have just gone on and on and on, and it was just so much fun to record in the lobby of the hotel I was staying at, and there was nobody there, and we just sat there and we were sharing a Texas tea cider, and just talking about his book and what does it mean to use the power of your story to inspire others. And Tony is so knowledgeable, and someone that I look up to as a leader, and want to be have a leadership profile like his. I'm going to get to see him here again in just a few weeks, as he is a keynote speaker at the largest HR conference in Texas, HR Southwest Conference. So I'm excited to see Tony again. And then the following week, I had Scott Miller, who is executive president of Thought Leadership at Franklin Covey. He's now launched out on his own and released several books. But we talked about just the things that Franklin Covey does. And he hosts the most listened to leadership podcast on leadership with Franklin Covey. Has 6 million weekly listeners, and just some of the really cool people that he's interviewed over the years, and eventually wrote a book called Master Mentors, which comes out soon. and has taken the lessons of his guests and done a profile on all of those. So just really neat guy to talk to. And then Karen Hurt and David Dye, authors of Courageous Cultures. This was a really neat episode because they reached out to me and said, "Hey, we've got this new book coming out. We'd love to send you an advanced copy for you to read and maybe have you on have us on as a guest." I was so excited to get that from them and talk to them, and just they were so much fun, and they speak to the heart of what does good culture look like in organizations. And so I was very excited that they would do something like that. I thought that was kind of the first time I felt like I made it big. I'm going to have authors now reaching out to me and wanting me to read their books. In fact, Scott on his last book, Marketing Mess to something else. Sorry, Scott. In a Marketing Mess to Leadership Success or something like that. And I got an advanced copy of that one too. And a couple months ago. And so it was kind of the first time I felt like, oh, okay, I've made it big. Then we talked about emotionally intelligent people and toxic people. And so just kind of, this one was a response to someone who I used to work with, who showed their true self, and how to deal with people who have high emotional intelligence, and how to deal with toxic people, and it's not good. And so we talked through, what does it look like to identify toxic people, and then we talked about the next week how successful leaders deal with failure. For me at that point in time, it felt like I had failed as a leader with some of the things that I've been working on, and so how do you as a leader deal with failure? It goes back to dealing with adversity. How do you deal with those things? We talked about what does it look like to deal with failure. Then we had Jamie Dander McKinney, coach, speaker, and author out of Denver. She cracked me up. In her bio, it says that she likes to rosé all day, and then she shows up with whiskey. And so she is a phenomenal leader, and still a supporter of the podcast. Jamie, if you're listening, thank you for continuing to reach out and check in with how things are going. Then we had the next episode, a rethinking of the golden rule, what we call the platinum rule. I am because they are. So as leaders, we are where we are because they are where they are. And so we talked through this rethinking of the golden rule, and so it was different to talk through this mentality. And there's a lot of people who had different ideas after that episode. Then we had special guest Jared Hanning. He's a master coach at Mindset Performance. And so we talked about just the psychology and using brain power and analytics to identify what that looks like as a leader. And so learn some things along the way. Then we had episode 49, my friend Seth McCauley, who's the vice president of HR at Kirby Smith Machinery and hosted the 6 Degrees or Less podcast. It was so much fun to talk to Seth. We've been, going back and forth all summer long about just opportunities and things, learning from each other. And it's like, hey, let's be on the podcast. So had him on and excited to have continued that relationship with Seth. Then we had episode 50 with Mayor Patrick Payton, and we talked about what it's like to lead a city in the midst of a pandemic, and what that looks like, and just some of the lessons that he's learned. And because he was just sworn in as mayor that year, and what a big change to have dealt with, a city in transition as a new mayor that was growing, one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And then you're throwing a pandemic and an oil crash, and there's a lot of people who were dealing with a lot of stuff, and he dealt with a lot of stuff. And it was so much fun to be able to record that live at Tall City with the audience, and Matt performed afterwards. Then episode 51, we had Mike Sorelli and George Randall, co-authors of the book, The Talent War. And they now are part of the talent group. Mike is a former Navy SEAL. George is a former Army intelligence officer, and just their stories of and looking at how do we win the war for talent and what does that look like in talent development, and the lessons that they've taken out of special forces work and leverage that for the corporate world. And we had Kevin Black of Black Market Leadership on for episode 42. And just, it was so much fun to talk to Kevin. He's another former Army officer, and just lessons that he's learned along the way, stories that he uses to teach leadership using stories from military history. And so we bonded over beers and battle stories, and it was so much fun to have that. And then we had Josh Rovner, author of Unbreak the System, on the show. Josh was such a phenomenal guest. It was an early morning episode, the earliest I've ever recorded on that one. And tried to find a coffee beer, but we found a Mexican hot chocolate stout since it was like 10 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the week, and had like, oh, we're gonna be early. Let's not just quite crack open a beer there. And then we had Brabo, another military guy, speaker, author, and co-host of the Bo and Luke Show. Great stories and lessons learned from Bo. The next episode 45. Man, I am like way off on these. 44, 45, 51, 52, 53, 54. 55, episode 55, I had John Garrett, author and host of What's Your And so John is a comedian and a podcaster and a financial professional, and told some great stories. I was later on his podcast, but he talks to people about, who are you beside your title, and talking about the importance of letting people know who you are beyond that, because you're more important than just your title. And so just talking about going to places like a networking event, saying, hey, my name's Kevin and I like airplanes. People find you way more interesting when you get to talk about yourself than about what you do. Then Andy Storch, author of Own Your Career and Own Your Life, who I met in Chicago, and I had no idea he was in Chicago until just a couple of weeks ago. I was like, wait, Andy was there too? But Andy had just released his first book, Own Your Career, Own Your Life, taking the lessons that actually I had learned when he was teaching in Chicago, and so had him on, and it was so much fun. Then our episode 57, to be honest, I don't really remember that one as well, and I have to go back and listen to it. Not a memorable episode, I guess. Then I had episode 58, Aaron Marquez, who is the CEO of Wildcat Oil Tools, author of Never Settle. He's also co-owner of Flecha Azul Tequila, along with PGA golfer Abraham Answer. And I think Mark Wahlberg just recently partnered with them on their tequila. So just a really neat story of what Aaron has done and built such a successful business here in our hometown of Midland. And so it was phenomenal just to get to sit down and visit with him in his office, which was really kind of cool that he would let us come record there. Then episode 59, I had the CEO of Stuckey Pecans, Stephanie Stuckey, and then Nick Purdy, who's the president of Wild Haven Beer there in Atlanta, both joined me. We talked about collaboration as leaders, because they had worked together on a beer using Stuckey Pecans and Wild Haven Beer. So we just talked to what does that look like to collaborate as leaders and create something new. And so they were it was really neat to talk to them. Then episode 60. So this was probably my favorite episode to have recorded in person, with Brian and Gabrielle Boucher in their apartment in downtown Dallas. And they have been such a big supporter. I've learned so much from them, and they continue to be good champions of the things that I've done, and the work that they've done with Purpose Mastery and the Purpose company is phenomenal to see the impact in developing leaders and entrepreneurs all around the world. And I'm grateful to call them friends, and I'm grateful that they live just a short 5-hour drive away, and have been big supporters along the way. In episode 61, we said grateful leaders make the best leaders. Again, just reiterating the importance of gratitude. And then we opened up 2021 with episode 62 and a group of leaders that I get to connect with every couple of weeks with CLIMB, which stands for Connect, Lead, Inspire, Mentor, and Build. So we've got this great group of people online that loves to just connect and go through books 2 or 3 months at a time, and then share conversations about what we've been reading and learning and how that impacts our businesses and our lives. And so it's just so much fun. So I had a panel of CLIMB members join me to open up 2021 on January 1st. Then we talked about critical thinking as the next great leadership skill, how leaders really need to have good critical thinking, because it was just that week that came out was just a weird, crazy week. And so critical thinking was one that definitely needed to be done. Episode 64, crafting culture, leading dynamic, engaging, inclusive teams. So I had talked about earlier that crafting culture was coming. This was the introduction to crafting culture. And what did that look like? What did the crafting culture academy look like? What were those 10 elements of crafting culture? And so it's kind of neat to be able to talk through those things. And then for my birthday, my absolute favorite episode to date, Major Trevor Aldridge, who had flown with the Air Force Thunderbirds, joined me. Another beer guy. We connected on social media and follow each other on Untapped, and always looking for different beer ideas. And so I had Major Aldridge join me on my birthday, and I got to talk to a Thunderbird pilot. So that was exciting to learn from him. Then my good friend Elisa Garn out in Utah SHRM executive director, joined us and had a great conversation just talking about people and culture. And she is just rocking it out there in Utah as a leader. And we talked about leading without the title in episode 67. You don't always need a title to be a leader, and you're not always a leader because you have a title. So we talked about just what those meant. Episode 68, harnessing organizational culture in 2021. 2020 was a weird year. 2021 is still a weird year. We're not over yet. Hopefully things are kind of moving back to what we feel like is, hey, this feels normal again. This feels about right. But there's still some changes happening. So we talked about how do we harness organizational culture. Episode 69, my good friend Heath Oakes, who is the senior territory sales manager at Colonial Life, joined me. He's written a book called Ignorance on Fire. And so we just talked about, what does that look like? What does ignorance on fire look like? What does it mean to just go full at it, even when you don't know what's going to happen, or what you don't even know? And so learned quite a bit from Heath. Then we talked about emotional intelligence and mental health and leadership. I didn't realize how important that particular episode 70, was going to be until later on this year, where I've had several guests on where we specifically talked about the importance of mental health and leadership. So talked through that. Then we talked about burnout, resiliency, and leadership, because it ties so much into emotional intelligence and mental health. So mental health is such a important thing that as leaders, we need to be aware of our own mental health, but we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Then I had special guest Summer Jelinek, who talked about the magic of leadership as someone who worked with Walt Disney and all the amazing things that the Disney company has done, and now working with another magical company here in Texas, and doing some things with them. Then we talked about the power of listening in episode 73, power of listening. We're going to talk about listening next week in episode 101. So I'm going to save that for next week, because I've got a really cool special guest coming next week. Then we had a special guest, Jacoby Kendrick, who is someone I met here through Matt New, who is Jacoby is a real estate executive, an entrepreneur, and an Air Force Academy graduate. So we talked about all the different things and lessons he's learned, and I just want to talk to him about those things. Then we talked with Jonathan Pritchard, who is an illusionist and author, and who was on America's Got Talent and with Penn and Teller. And it was just fun for episode 75 to talk to an entertainer like that. But he had some really great lessons for leadership in using the power of illusion, which is really just how do you make people see what you want them to see? And as leaders, how do we leverage that? So it was really fun. Then it was episode 76 was actually a second part. I had a chance to join the Beer with the Boys podcast with a special 2-part episode. So they came on, the two guys, Jeremy and oh, sorry guys, it's been a while and I've been drinking. But Beer with the Boys, and they so two young guys up in Wisconsin, both very involved in youth wrestling as coaches and also as involved with university life. And so just lessons along those. So it was neat to talk to them. They actually had a lot to share, even though they felt like they were not qualified. It was just really fun, but it was so funny when I reached out to them because they had posted a image of their logo, and they had Dan Eck, who was my second guest on their podcast. I was like, oh yeah, I recognize this logo. Well, they had used the same logo template that I had started out with, and it was just kind of funny to see, like, wait, y'all are using the same one. Who are these guys, and why is it we still have all the similarities? But they were very gracious, and I really appreciated them coming on, and then I got to go hang out and drink a couple of beers with them and just shoot the breeze. So it was a lot of fun. Then we had Brett Putter, who is a CEO of culture organization in London, and it was neat because he was in Barcelona. I mean, again, it's just neat to talk to people all on the other sides of the world. So he was on there. Then Elizabeth McCormick, episode 78, who is a former Army Black Hawk helicopter pilot, and now a speaker on leadership and women's empowerment. So she was just so much fun. She was a fireball of a guest. I absolutely loved it. Episode 79, Jim Hodling, who is a former Chief Master Sergeant, United States Air Force, and was a Command Master Chief for the Air National Guard. So a highest ranking enlisted person for the U.S. Air Force Air National Guard, now as a leadership consultant. And it was so much fun to get to talk to him. I very much appreciated his time. Then episode 80, two of my good legal friends, Paul Simon and Dustin Pascal, who are partners in the law firm Simon Pascal, and talked about what is leading look like in the legal realm, and how do we, as leaders, limit our legal liabilities. So those guys are very knowledgeable and also great drinking buddies. Then we talked about episode 81, the social enterprise disrupted, talking about how work-life balance isn't really a thing. We want it to be a thing, but it's not a thing. And then we also talked about super teams. Then episode 82, I had special guest Dave Gordon. Dave is another person I forgot about that was in Chicago with me last February. He had written a book called Tip. My friend Greg McKenna, the day after I got laid off, called me and said, hey, I would love to introduce you to Dave. It was Greg's boss at the time. And he's like, I think you'd be a great fit for your show. And so I messaged, or he's like, can I share your contact with Dave? I'm sure. I get a text from Dave. We're having this hour-long phone call the next day, and he was just so amazing and so nice. And he's like, hey, whatever I can do to help you, like, I want to see you succeed. I want to see all these things. And it helps when, he's got a famous brother, John Gordon, who's another leadership expert who's gotten several best-selling books around the world. And, but Dave came on and we talked about Tip and the strategies that he has written in his story and the lessons learned along the way. And Dave was just another very, very special guest and a supporter of the podcast, and someone that I really appreciate having come on the show. Episode 83, my friend Leanne Lagasse up in Lubbock came on, and we talked about strengths-based leadership, and we geeked out over that whole conversation. What does it look like to be involved in understanding your strengths and using those as leaders? Then episode 84, one of my former professors, Dr. Ryan Peckham, who is my marketing professor, came on, and we talked about lessons in leadership. And then funny, that, all this time after being in his class, he comes on my show, and we had just released his first podcast where he had hired me to help produce it. The Investor Professor podcast, which has been doing phenomenal. So if you're listening and you're wanting to learn more about different ideas around investing, and not necessarily investing financially, but how do you invest in yourself? Go listen to the Investor Professor podcast with Dr. Ryan Peckham. Then episode 85. So this one was really kind of funny. I recorded this actually in April with Allison Little. So Allison and I had connected on social media because we both found out that we were going to be on this show called 4 Days to Save the World. And so I had seen her picture pop up in an email for a podcast guest list. And I reached out to Allison and said, "Hey, Allison, I see you have a podcast and I have a podcast. Would you want to come on the show?" She's like, "Yeah, and I've got one too. Like, why don't you come on mine?" And so we recorded same day. I did hers and then she did mine. And then we said, "Well, let's release this while we're in Miami. We're filming 4 Days to Save the World." So we did. And so it was so much fun to talk to Allison. She's done an amazing job with her brand launch with Allison Little, the launch conference. She had Scott Miller, who I had on as her keynote speaker recently at that conference. So it was just really fun to talk to Allison and then see her in person as we're filming what has become the most important television series ever filmed. And that kicked off a string of guests from 4 Days to Save the World. I still have more to come, but when you have 100 leaders from around the world coming together to solve global social issues in 4 days, as a podcast host, that's like the perfect pipeline of great leaders to talk to. And so I started reaching out to as many people as I could to get them on the show. And so after Allison, my good friend Diane Tucker, who was my team captain for 4 Days to Save the World, came on. And Diane is one of the hardest working people I ever met and is involved in so many things. She is the CEO of 3 companies, CEO of another 3, is a producer of the show, 4 Days to Save the World, and led our team, and is a big supporter in my life now, and someone I very much value and hope to continue to work with for long to come. Then I had Jen Opke, who is a former Air Force pilot and a co-owner in a brewery here in West Texas. She's in Washington, D.C. So, hey, can I talk about this brewery that I'm a part of? Old Tuscaloosa. I'm like, that's in Amarillo. That's like 4 hours away from me. That's kind of cool. But we talked about just lessons in leadership and her experiences in the military as a pilot, and inspiring the next generation of women in aviation, which is something that I definitely support, and wanted to talk to her about how do we get young women to be inspired to do big things like being fighter pilots or just being the best versions of themselves. Then episode 88, another one of my team members, Brian Joseph, who is the CEO of RevGen Group. They're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And how do we help nonprofit leaders understand that just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean that you can't run your organization like a business? And how do we inspire those leaders to lead and develop their own teams? And so Brian joined me on the podcast. Luckily, he's just down 5 hours down the road again from where I am. And so just really, really great. Then I had Jose Ramon Ristra, who is an advisor on 4 Days to Save the World. He's also a CEO of a large property management company, and just lessons learned from him. Had so much fun. And then episode 90, Ted Wakeman, who runs a school out in California. In fact, If you're listening to this, you can go watch his episode of 4 Days to Save the World since it's already out. And as he's trying to reinvent the education system, and that that group, they've done some very inspiring work. So all three of their episodes are online now, and you can go watch that on the H2H app, on whether you get it from Apple TV or Google, or it's all over the place. You can find it, but Ted's doing some amazing things trying to figure out how do we reinvent the education system, and how do we as leaders leverage what we have in the corporate world to really help bring up the next generation of leaders by reinventing education. Then I had my friend Rich Curran, who runs a company, runs a couple companies, but is in the expo business, is a former Marine, and is doing some amazing things there in Miami. And just how do you deal with running a company that's built on people being in live events that has all of a sudden shifted and shut down because of a global pandemic, and just an amazing story there. Then we have Stacy Rasky, who is a firebrand of a woman in leadership, a kick-ass biker chick, and amazing leader. This is the first episode that we dropped the F-bomb in. I try not to do too often, but that was the first one we actually did that. Very unfiltered, and Stacy was so much fun to have on, as we talked about just the lessons about what makes up your unique recipe as a leader. Then episode 93, my friend Andrew Smith, who was on podcast. Andrew is from Australia. So we just went all off the rails, had no idea what was going to happen, but that was really a picture into what our team dynamic was on the show. Just if you want to know what it's like to be on our team, just go listen to that episode. Andrew and I go all over the place, trying to solve big issues and cracking jokes at the same time. Then episode 94, my friend Archie cares. Archie messaged me about, and we talked about mental health and suicide and the struggle that some leaders carry, and the struggle that a lot of people carry, and why it's important to be advocates for mental health. And then we had Ernie Humphrey, CEO of Treasury Webinars. A lot of information about leading and financial opportunities and things like that Ernie had to share. Episode 96, so this goes all the way back to Chicago. Christine DiDonato with Career Revolution finally joined me, and then I find out that Andy Stork, she was on the podcast, was also there, and so that kind of closed out my whole Chicago connections to the show. But Christine was one of the few people that I met that I just felt very inspired by what she was doing, and I reached out to her, and she was so excited to come on, and we talked through that journey and how in a year and a half, the lessons that she taught that I learned had played out so much. So she was very excited to get to talk to somebody that's like, hey, this is a former student of mine, and let's talk about some of those lessons and what does it look like to develop a career revolution. Then episode 97, my good friend Mandy Morris, as we talked again about mental health and normalizing mental health and leadership. She kind of flipped it on me, and it kind of became a little bit of a therapy session. So it was just fun to be able to talk through those things. Episode 98, Dr. Brent Whitlock, another person from 4 Days to Save the World. Mandy was 4 Days to Save the World. Ernie was 4 Days to Save the World. Archie was 4 Days to Save the World. But Brent is as I had Brent on, we talked about, again, it kind of got into mental health resources, because as an attorney, he mentioned the fact that how much stress and mental health issues that attorneys have, and the suicide rate within the attorney community, and just being advocates as leaders in that role, and then also talking through legal stuff as leaders. How do we lead in a legal world? And then finally, last week, episode 99, I had Dr. Harvey Castro, and just an amazing story of his upbringing and the success revolution that he has created as an entrepreneur in the medical fields, and being someone who was also 4 Days to Save the World, but just such an amazing individual, another person who's also just down the road from me in here in Texas. So grateful for all those people that have made the last 99 episodes happen, but it wouldn't have happened had it not been for you, the listener, who's been following along with me. Whether this is your first time interacting with the Leaders and Lagers podcast, first time seeing me, and you're like, well, who's this goofy guy in West Texas who's talking about leadership and drinking beer and doesn't quite look like what we expect to be a leader. Remember, I was told I wasn't qualified, but this is who you got. And or if you've been with us from the very beginning, I'm so grateful that you've stuck with us this long and been a part of our journey. And so whether we keep going, I've got some great content still to come and videos, and you may see me at conferences and events over the next few years. 4 Days to Save the World is out on television right now. You'll see me in season 2, which will come out in April of next year, as we try to conquer climate change as a team, along with a couple other teams. And but just thank you for 100 episodes. Thank you for being part of this journey. And who knows what the next 100 episodes will bring. But I'm so excited to have been on this journey. And I hope you'll join us next week for another glass and conversation, because you're not going to want to miss what's coming next week. See y'all then.